You are listening to KSG Podcast. This is a short, crisp, concise, exam oriented, edited editorial for civil services aspirants. In this podcast, we are going to talk about how many satellites are orbiting the Earth. Source for the content is the Economic Times. It seems like every week another rocket is launched into space carrying rovers to Mars, tourists, or most commonly, satellites. The idea that space is getting crowded has been around for a few years now, but just how crowded is it, and how crowded is it going to get? Many satellites that were put into orbit have gone dead and burned up in the atmosphere, but thousands remain. Groups that track satellite launches don't always report the same exact numbers, but the overall trend is clear and astounding. Since the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first human made satellite in 1957, humanity has steadily been putting more and more objects into orbit every year. Over the second half of the 20th century, there was a slow but steady growth, with roughly 60 to 100 satellites launched yearly until the early 2010s. But since then, the pace has been increasing dramatically. By 2020, 114 launches carried out 1,300 satellites to space, surpassing the 1,000 new satellites per year mark for the first time. But no year in the past compares to 2021. As of 16 September 2021, roughly 1,400 new satellites have already begun circling the Earth, and that will only increase as the year goes on. Just this week, SpaceX deployed another 51 Starlink satellites into orbit. Now, smaller the satellites, the more easy the access to orbit. There are two main reasons for this exponential growth. First, it has never been easier to get a satellite into space. For example, on 29th of August 2021, a SpaceX rocket carried several satellites, including one built by students, to the International Space Station. On 11th October 2021, these satellites will deploy into orbit, and the number of satellites will increase again. The second reason is that rockets can carry more satellites more easily and cheaply than ever before. This increase is not due to rockets getting more powerful, rather, satellites have gotten smaller thanks to the electronics revolution. The vast majority, 94% of all spacecraft launched in 2020, were small satellites that weigh less than around 1,320 pounds, that is 600 kilograms. The majority of these satellites are used for observing Earth or for communications and internet, with the goal of bringing the internet to underserved areas of the globe. Two private companies, Starlink by SpaceX and OneWeb together, launched almost 1,000 small sats in 2020 alone. They are each planning to launch more than 40,000 satellites in the coming years to create what are called mega-constellations in low Earth orbit. Several other companies are eyeing this 1 trillion US dollar market, most notably Amazon with its project Kuiper. So now the question of a crowded sky comes up. With a huge growth in satellites, fears of a crowded sky are starting to come true. A day after SpaceX launched its first 60 Starlink satellites, astronomers began to see them blocking out the stars. While the impact on visible astronomy is easy to understand, radio astronomers fear they may lose 70% sensitivity in certain frequencies due to interference from satellite mega-constellations like Starlink. Experts have been studying and discussing the potential problems posed by these constellations and ways the satellite companies could address them. These include reducing the number and brightness of satellites, sharing their location, and supporting better image processing software. As low Earth orbit gets crowded, concern about space debris increases, as does a real possibility of collisions. Now let's talk about the future trends. Less than 10 years ago, the democratization of space was a goal yet to be realized. Now, with student projects on the space station and more than 105 countries having at least one satellite in space, one could argue that that goal is within reach. Every disruptive technological advancement requires updates to the rules or the creation of new ones. SpaceX has tested ways to lower the impact of Starlink constellations, and Amazon has disclosed plans to deorbit their satellites within 355 days after mission completion. These and other actions by different stakeholders makes one hopeful that commerce, science, and human endeavors will find sustainable solutions to this potential crisis. That's it for this podcast. Thank you so much for listening. To join KSG India courses and to crack the IELTS exam, visit ksgindia.com. You can also get a PDF of this podcast on ksgindia.com.